The number my daughter-in-law said out loud at that dinner table wasn't the part that stayed with me. It was the way my son nodded when she said it, like he'd rehearsed the nod, like he'd been practicing agreeing with her in the mirror. I set my water glass down very carefully. We just think, my son said, that it makes more sense for everyone. He's 41 years old. I've known him since he weighed 8 pounds and 3 ounces, since he couldn't sleep unless I was in the room, since he's cried at his own 5th birthday party because the cake was the wrong color blue. And sitting across from me at that table, in that house I helped them buy, he wouldn't quite meet my eyes. For everyone, I repeated. His wife, my daughter-in-law, Petra, tilted her head the way she does when she thinks she's being reasonable. She has this particular brand of smile, the kind that doesn't move her eyes. We did the math, Sandra. With childcare costs the way they are right now, it just doesn't pencil out for me to go back to work after the baby comes. And you could retire. You've been at the firm a long time. I turned 63 in March. I have been a licensed CPA for 31 years. I have my own clients. I have a 401(n) that I have been quietly and carefully building since 1994, when my son was still watching Saturday morning cartoons in footy pajamas. I have a life that I built, specifically and deliberately, so that I would not find myself in a position like this. And I was sitting in their dining room. Sage green walls, a light fixture my son told me cost $1,100, a table that seats 10, even though they've never had more than 6 people for dinner at one time. Being told that the sensible thing, the thing that made sense for everyone, was for me to stop working. To become, as far as I could tell, an unpaid nanny. What exactly, I said slowly, did the math look like? Petra glanced at my son. He cleared his throat. Full-time infant care in our area runs about $2,800 a month, he said. And with the mortgage and the car payments and everything else, it's a lot. $2,800 a month. I kept my face very still. And your salary, I said to Petra. What does that look like? She blinked. That's kind of personal, Sandra. You just asked me to retire, I said. Based on your math, I'd like to see the math. The silence that followed was not comfortable. My son reached for his wine glass. Petra looked at the table. Outside, a car went past on the street, and the sound of it seemed very loud. Here is the thing about numbers. I have spent my entire career in numbers. Not because I love spreadsheets, though I do, genuinely. I find them peaceful the way some people find gardens peaceful. But because numbers don't lie. Numbers don't tilt their heads and smile with their mouths while their eyes stay flat. Numbers don't practice nodding in mirrors. Numbers just sit there and tell you what is true, whether you like it or not. And I had looked at their numbers before I came to dinner that night. Not because I was suspicious, because I am their mother and their family. And when my son had called me 3 weeks earlier and said, vaguely, that he wanted to talk about some family planning, some logistics, I had done what I have always done. I got organized. I did not bring a folder to that dinner. I want to be clear about that. I am not a person who brings folders to family dinners to make a point. But I had the numbers in my head, the way I always do, neat and ordered and ready. I had looked at the house. The Zillow estimate on their home sat at $740,000. They had purchased it 4 years ago for $690,000, with a down payment that had included $40,000 from me and $20,000 from my son's father. The mortgage on that house, at the rate they'd gotten in 2021, was somewhere around $3,000 a month. Fine. That was fine. I had looked at the cars. My son drives a lease. A mid-sized SUV that I happen to know runs him about $680 a month because he mentioned it once, proudly, the way he used to tell me about good grades. Petra drives a car she bought outright, a used Acura, nothing wrong with that. I had looked at the credit. My son had mentioned, offhandedly, at Christmas, that they'd used a home equity line of credit to redo the kitchen. The kitchen is beautiful. The counters are quartz. There is a pot filler over the stove, which is a thing I did not know existed until I saw it, and which costs, apparently, quite a lot to install. He had not mentioned how much they'd drawn on that line. He had not mentioned when it was resetting. I found out later. I won't say how. But a HELOC taken out in early 2022, used substantially, resets to a fully amortizing payment after a draw period. Typically 10 years, sometimes less, depending on the terms. Even with a shorter draw period, the payment shift on a balance of, say, $60,000 or $70,000 is not nothing. It is, in fact, the kind of thing that can quietly bury a household that is already stretched thin. They were already stretched thin. I knew this. I had known it, vaguely, before that dinner, the way you know something you don't want to look at directly. My son makes good money. He is in pharmaceutical sales. His base is somewhere around 90, and with commission, in a good year, he can see 120, 130. Petra, before her maternity leave began, was managing a dental office. She made about 65. That's real money. That is a real income for two real people. That is not a household that cannot afford daycare. That is a household that has made a series of decisions, one after another, that have eaten that money quietly, in bites small enough to ignore. I'm not trying to make this uncomfortable, I said, after the silence had gone on long enough. I just want to understand what we're solving for. We're solving for childcare, Petra said. Her voice had an edge on it now. You have a childcare cost of roughly $2,800 a month, I said. You also have a household income of, I paused. What would you say? Currently, with Petra on leave? My son shifted in his seat. It's not that simple. It rarely is, I agreed. But let's try. Your base plus commission, average year, call it 115. Petra goes back full-time, 65. That's 180,000 gross. In this state, after taxes, you're looking at somewhere around 128, maybe 135 take-home, depending on your withholdings. That's roughly 10,800 to 11,000 a month. Neither of them said anything. Your mortgage is around 3,000, I said. Your car lease is 680. I'm estimating utilities, groceries, insurance. Call it another 2,500, and I'm probably being conservative. That puts you at just over 6,000 in fixed and near-fixed expenses before the HELOC reset. Petra's fork, which she had been holding for the last several minutes without using, went down onto her plate. How do you know about the HELOC? She asked. My son told me about the kitchen renovation, I said. The kitchen required financing. The financing had terms. The terms matter. She stopped. Looked at my son. My son looked at me, and for just a moment the practiced expression he'd been wearing all evening slipped. He looked, very briefly, like a boy who had miscounted his change and knew it. Mom, he said, quietly. I'm not here to embarrass anyone, I said, and I meant it. I want to say that clearly, for anyone who thinks this story is about winning, about being right, about the satisfaction of watching someone's face when the numbers don't add up. It wasn't any of those things. It was my son. It is always my son. He's 41 years old, and he still, underneath everything, needs his mother to help him count. I'm not retiring, I said. Not yet, and not for this reason. But I want to help you, and I can't help you if we're not being honest about what the problem actually is. The kitchen had gotten very quiet. My grandson, who was not yet born, who was the reason we were all sitting at that table, would arrive in about 7 weeks. The baby monitor on the counter, bought in anticipation, blinked a soft green. Petra stood up and went to the sink. She stood there with her back to us for a moment. I watched my son watch her. There is a dynamic in some marriages that takes a long time to see clearly. You love your child, you want to believe the best of the person they chose, and sometimes you watch them agree, again and again, to things that you can see aren't working, because agreement is easier than the conversation underneath it. We refinanced, my son said, finally. Last year. The rate wasn't great. How much did you draw on the line? A pause. 62,000. I nodded. I had guessed 60 to 70. I was not pleased to be right. And when does the draw period end? 8 months, he said. 8 months. The baby would be 7 months old. The reset on 62,000, depending on the rate, and rates had climbed significantly since they'd taken that line out, would add somewhere between $500 and $700 to their monthly obligations, on top of everything else. Okay, I said. Petra turned around from the sink. Her eyes were wet, which I had not expected. Petra is not, in my experience, a crier. She is a woman who tilts her head and smiles with her mouth, who schedules and plans and presents. But right now she looked tired. She looked like someone who had been holding a great deal of weight for a long time and had finally put it down somewhere they couldn't pick it back up. "We didn't want you to think we'd been irresponsible," she said. "Oh, honey," I said. And I surprised myself because I meant it. I have not always found Petra easy. She came into my son's life when he was 36, and she had strong opinions about the way things should be done, and some of those opinions rubbed against me in ways I'd spent years navigating quietly. But right then, watching her stand at that sink with her hand on her very round stomach and her eyes bright with tears she was trying not to let fall, she was just a woman who was scared. She was going to have a baby in 7 weeks, and her finances were a mess, and she had come up with the only solution she could think of, which was to ask for help in the only way she knew how, which was to make it sound like a plan. She hadn't been trying to use me. She'd been trying not to drown. My son put his head in his hands for a moment. Then he looked up. "We're in over our heads," he said. A little, I agreed. I stayed for another 2 hours that night. We did not eat much of the dinner. We sat at that $1,100 light fixture table, and we went through things, line by line, the way I have done with clients for 30 years, except that this was my son, and it was different in every way that mattered. The lease on the SUV had 18 months left. Not ideal, but manageable. We could look at what made sense when it ended. The HELOC was the real problem. $62,000 at a reset rate that was going to hurt them. I had some thoughts about that, some options worth exploring, depending on their current home equity position. The house had appreciated, not dramatically, but enough. Petra made coffee somewhere around 9 o'clock, and we kept going. She had a spreadsheet too, as it turned out. She pulled it up on her laptop and showed it to me, and it was not a bad spreadsheet. She had tracked everything, carefully, in columns with color coding. The problem was not that she hadn't looked at the numbers. The problem was that the numbers she'd been looking at were the ones from a year and a half ago, before the rate environment changed, before the reset loomed, before the baby had become, abruptly and gloriously, real. "You modeled Petra not going back," I said. She nodded. "And if she does go back, in 6 months, say, once the baby's in a routine. What does that look like?" She hadn't modeled that. I could tell by the pause. We modeled it together. 65,000 minus taxes, minus the childcare. Yes, the childcare cost money. It cost real money. I was not pretending it didn't. But the net contribution to the household was still meaningful. It was the difference between a family that was slowly suffocating under its own fixed costs and a family that had room to breathe. "It still feels like all my salary just goes to childcare," Petra said. "For right now," I said. "For a few years. And then it doesn't. I know this because I lived it." I went back to work when my son was 4 months old, and I dropped him at a home daycare run by a woman named Mrs. Patricia Chen, who smelled like lavender and who sang to the babies while she fed them lunch, and I cried in my car for the first 3 weeks. I cried, and then I drove to work, and I did my job, and I built the career that is, 30 years later, funding my own retirement on my own terms. I did not say this out loud, it was not the moment, but I thought it. What I said out loud was, daycare is not a waste. It's an investment in the flexibility that protects all 3 of you. My son nodded, and this time it wasn't the practice nod. This time he was nodding because he was thinking. Around 10:30, I got my coat. My daughter-in-law walked me to the door, which she has not always done, and she stopped with her hand on the door frame and looked at me for a moment. "I'm sorry," she said. "About the retirement thing. It was." She shook her head. "We didn't have a better idea." "You didn't need a better idea," I said. "You needed to say you were scared. That's different." She nodded. Something shifted in her face, the set of it, the way she was holding her shoulders. She looked younger, briefly. "Will you help us?" she asked. "Figure it out?" "I've been helping figure things out since 1982, I said. "I'm not about to stop." She laughed. It was the first real laugh of the evening, and it was tired and a little watery, but it was real. She put her arms around me, carefully, around the middle section of herself that was going to be my grandson in 7 weeks, and I held her for a moment at the door. My son appeared behind her. He looked wrung out. He looked, honestly, like he might also cry, and I made a decision that the kindest thing I could do was pretend not to notice. I'll email you some resources, I told him, on HELOC refinancing options. And there's a credit union I know that has a good rate on personal consolidation loans right now if the math works out that way. Okay, he said, and you need to call your lender before the reset. Don't wait until 8 months becomes 4 months. I know. You don't know, I said, not unkindly. You know that you should know. That's different. Call them. He laughed then too. We have always spoken to each other in this language, my son and I, the gentle, specific, slightly exasperated shorthand of people who love each other and know each other too well to pretend. I drove home on streets I know by heart, through a town I have lived in for 27 years. My house is smaller than theirs. 3 bedrooms, a little under 1,600 square feet, a kitchen that has the original countertops from 1987, and a coffee maker that is neither smart nor connected to anything. I pulled into my driveway and sat there for a moment with the engine running. My retirement account, as of last quarter, sits at $412,000. My own mortgage has 14 months left on it. I have a savings cushion. I have a pension from a job I left 15 years ago that will kick in at 65, modest but mine. I have a financial life that I have been constructing, carefully, for 3 decades, specifically because I knew, because women of my generation who paid attention understood, collectively and quietly, in the marrow, that no one was going to construct it for me. I was not going to retire early to solve a problem that was not, at its heart, a childcare problem. I went inside. I put on tea. I thought about my son, 41 years old, sitting at that table with his head in his hands. I thought about Petra, at the sink, trying not to cry. I thought about 7 weeks from now, when there would be a baby. My grandson, small and new, and specifically and entirely himself, in a way that babies are before they become anyone in particular. I thought about the version of the future in which we had actually had a different conversation tonight, in which I had said yes, or said nothing, or let the dinner pass without taking it apart. A version in which I smiled and nodded and called the firm the next morning. No, I thought. No, that's not the help that helps. The tea kettle clicked. I poured my cup and stood at my own kitchen counter, in my small house with the 1987 countertops, and I felt something I want to try to name correctly because it wasn't exactly pride, and it wasn't exactly peace, and it wasn't exactly sadness, though it was all of those things in different proportions. Not easily, of a thing done correctly. Not without cost, but correctly. The way a column of numbers feels when it finally balances. Not because you made it balance, not because you fudged anything or rounded anything up, but because you sat with it long enough and looked at it honestly, and the truth was there all along, waiting. I carried my tea to the living room. I sat in the chair by the window, the one I've had since the year my son started kindergarten, the one with the worn armrest that I should have reupholstered years ago and never have, I thought. Call the lender. Before 8 months becomes 4, I thought. She has a spreadsheet. That means something, I thought. He nodded at the end, like himself. Outside, the neighborhood was quiet the way it only gets after 10 o'clock on a weeknight in November, when the families are all indoors and the lights in the windows are warm and specific. My neighbor across the street still had his porch light on. 2 houses down, someone's dog barked once and then stopped. 7 weeks. I sipped my tea and let myself think about it. Just that, just the simple fact of it. Not the HELOC, not the reset date, not the childcare math. Just 7 weeks, and then a small new person in the world, and all of us figuring out how to be a family around him. I've been doing that my whole life. Figuring out how. It turns out it never really ends. It just changes shape. I'm not retiring yet. But I did go to sleep that night easier than I had in a long time.